Ladies and gentlemen, it's a pleasure to welcome Karen Morrison.
It's a pleasure to be here today to talk about one of my favorite topics, and really that's the relationship between ecology and health. And I have quite a bit of information that I wanted to sort of share with you today, so maybe I'll launch right in. First, I wanted to just give you a brief introduction to EcoHealth Ontario. This is a very new... Good thing I put the lid on. Just in case I start to cough, which I may well. Anyway, this is a very new organization that just started about a year and a half ago here in Ontario. And it's really emerged out of some of the work that was being done by a group of people interested in watersheds as settings for health. So some of the conservation authorities, some of the local public health units, but also some interest that Trees Ontario, which I think is now Forests Ontario, was also interested in looking at forests and trees and health. So there are a group of people sort of not working together, but all working on very similar topics. And we decided to come together and basically formed a group called EcoHealth Ontario. It's chaired by Mike Puddester of Credit Valley Conservation, and co-chaired as well by Peggy Walsh, who's the head of the Ontario Public Health Association. And then the members are mostly conservation authorities, environmental NGOs, public health agencies, and things like that. So this is just new and starting in Ontario, but we're really hoping it will create a lot more opportunities for this kind of dialogue about the relationship between ecology and health in the province. This mic seems a bit odd, but we'll keep going. So this is the mission statement of EcoHealth Ontario: to build a common agenda to foster improved health and well-being outcomes for Ontarians through the provision of better ecosystem quality, increased green space, and enhanced access to nature. And as mentioned, I'm also, just for another few weeks actually, the Vice President of the International Association for Ecology and Health. And that's the global sort of scholarly association that oversees the journal EcoHealth. So there's a journal EcoHealth, and there's kind of an international community of scholars literally in the four corners of the world, all interested in these kind of relationships. So it's a new and a growing field. There's some overlap with, you might have heard of One Health or Planetary Health and EcoHealth. They're all sort of working along the same lines, maybe coming from different disciplinary backgrounds. But what I wanted to launch right into today was just this idea of when we talk about health, often when we think about health, we think about sickness. And so just to get that off the plate, that healthcare is really about sickness care. It's about being sick, going to the doctor, and getting some treatment. So it's primarily oriented to treating sick people. Primary prevention, that we'll talk about in a minute, so preventing people from becoming sick, has the lowest budget of any part of the health system. And then when you try to link ecology and health, you're pushing the boundaries of primary prevention, and in a way that's already not necessarily accepted in public health. So that acceptance is very slowly growing, but certainly what we're talking about here is on the fringes. So I don't want to give you the idea that these are well-accepted ideas necessarily, but it's certainly the landscape is changing every day in this field. And we'll talk about some of the reasons for that in a minute. And you can see that public health traditionally wasn't interested in anything to do with the places that we live. But in the last 10 or 15 years, it's really changed, and they've embraced the role in the built environment. So public health sees that it has a role in livable communities, walkability, all of these aspects of living in a healthy community. And so what we're saying is it shouldn't be that much more of a step to go beyond the built environment to think about the rivers, the trees, the air, the biodiversity that sustains us as well. And the public health budget is already small, and it's been decreasing. So between 2010 and 2014, which is when I had the latest information, there was a 14% budget decrease and a 26% specifically for health promotion, for trying to keep people healthy. And just to further beat this dead horse, but public health gets 1.9% of the overall federal budget, and the environment gets much less than that. Compared to the environment, public health is wealthy. way, but public health is not actually all that wealthy. So in public health, traditionally I've mentioned primary prevention, so that's action that we take to try to keep people from getting sick. Vaccines are an obvious one, but also health promotion, giving you information, giving you messages about behavior, things that you can do to keep yourself healthy. That's called primary prevention. Secondary prevention is if you've already been diagnosed with a disease in the early stages, how can you, get on top of that really quickly? So that's mostly going to your doctor. And tertiary prevention is treatment of sickness care for people who have a disease. And so that's often the tertiary level is the hospitals and specialized clinics. The reason I mention this is there's a very influential person in EcoHealth, Anthony McMichael from the World Health Organization, who started to use the language in 2001 about zero-level prevention. And so he was trying to get in there into the public health rhetoric to say, actually, greenhouse gas mitigation is fundamental to public health prevention. So unless we have a planet we can live on, it won't matter how sick we are because we'll be dead anyway. So this idea of zero-level prevention and trying to get climate change into this dialogue about what it means to be healthy is really important. Unfortunately, in public health, one of the reasons that they lose their budgets fairly quickly, despite things like SARS that will raise temporary awareness, is the more successful you are in public health, the more invisible you are, because everybody's not sick. And so it's a real paradox that the better you are at your job, the less people want to give you money to do it because you're too successful. And I'd argue there's a similar thing that we can think about in terms of ecological prevention and how successful we are and how invisible that is, and how crises, of course, become important. Because when we talk about trees and the environment and its relationship to our health, we're mostly talking about the fact that these features tend to promote our health. They tend to keep us healthier. And that's actually very difficult because it's much easier to measure sickness than to measure health. And so the absence of disease is very hard to prove. How do you know you're not sick? How do you know you're healthy? And so it can be very subjective. It's asking for people's self-reported feelings, and it can be highly individual. How you feel in terms of your health may be very different to somebody who's, equally healthy to you, but maybe more cynical or, less resilient. There are some definitions of health. You may have heard of them, but the WHO has the most commonly accepted definition: health as a state of complete physical, mental, and social well-being, not merely the absence of disease or infirmity. So despite the fact that we focus most of our health attention on disease, the WHO definition certainly flags attention to that. That doesn't need to be the case. There's also another definition from the WHO, which looks more at if health is a state or at a single point in time, how healthy are you? The Alma-Ata Declaration really thinks about health as a process. So the extent to which an individual or group is able, on the one hand, to realize aspirations and satisfy needs, and on the other, to change or cope with the environment. And so as you think about what it means to be healthy, you can think about either how do I feel at this moment, or what do I have in terms of my skills and my networks and my resilience to be able to maintain and continue to be in a healthy place. And that's good for thinking about the environment as well. I point this out because, unfortunately, public health has in the past co-opted the language of the environment in a really terrible way that makes it really hard to cross fields, because people are easily, you use the word ecological in public health, and this is the place where all of the public health officials' minds will go. It's the ecological model for health promotion. So you would think that you were talking about the same thing. And sadly, you're really not. The ecological model simply is very useful in embedding people in a larger social context and thinking about their health in terms of that social context. But the question is, where is the environment in this model? And traditionally, it has never been in this model, because traditionally public health has not been particularly interested, again, with this new exception of the built environment in the last 15 years, But it really, when you say ecological, it's not what we're thinking. I'm gonna group you all as ecologists here, rightly or wrongly. So there is no ecology in this model, and that's significant because people are trained in public health to think about an ecological model in which there is no natural world. And they don't question, where should it be? But there is change is happening. And one of the changes that we've really found that we have to latch onto in a way with EcoHealth Ontario, just trying to talk about what we're doing, is that we find that until people embrace this idea that our health is embedded in the health of the planet, in the health of the natural ecosystem, then we don't get very far. Unless people can accept that environmental change affects their health, then they're not going to want to hear about trees or watersheds or anything else. And that's why this model becomes really important, because it takes the traditional ecological model of health, which is the whole middle part, but then it extends it to the built environment, but then to the natural environment, which is kind of what we're focused on here today with trees, and out into the global ecosystem of climate change and biodiversity. And so this model and other similar ones like it are actually very powerful, and it's a very different dialogue that they open up to the one that has been available to us in the past. Other language that we use to talk about health is the determinants of health. And so we talk about the social determinants of health, and that means thinking about health in terms of all of the factors that are acting on you that either facilitate your ability to be healthy or detract from that ability to realize your full potential of health. So poverty is an obvious one as a social determinant of health. The more poor you are, the less likely you are to be as healthy. Inequity, exclusion, education, so the less educated you are, the poorer your outcomes, health outcomes as a general rule. And you can see some of the other ones there, including gender. So we talk about the social determinants, but we can equally talk about the environmental determinants, but we haven't done a lot of talking. The social determinants have been getting a lot of attention. The Public Health Agency of Canada is doing a lot of work, and you'll hear a lot about health equity. So people talk a lot about public health, and they talk about health equity. And that's really code for talking about the social determinants of health, addressing poverty to address health, addressing education to address health. But we don't talk about these environmental determinants, but they're equally as relevant. I hope to be able to convince you of that today. When we do talk about the environmental determinants of health, we separate them into the ones that are proximal. And those have been the ones that public health, when it has thought about the environment, has thought about these determinants. Because a lot of what you think of when you hear the words environmental health in public health is about occupational health and safety and hygiene and general cleanliness. And it's to keep the bugs away from you. So the biological agents, the infectious disease, the things that are going to get you, and they're going to get you quickly, and you're going to be able to make a connection to the fact, oh, I ate that, I'll say, rancid tomato, since my father's sitting here in the audience. He'll know what I mean. Then there's an immediate feedback between eating something that's rotten and getting very sick. Local air pollutants have a similar thing. You may feel, if you've been to China, for example, or if you've been to Southeast Asia at all, and you're breathing the air, and then all of a sudden you notice that you're not breathing as well, and then your eyes are itching, and then your eyes are watering. There's almost a very quick reaction, and you can make that link in your mind to your environment and how it's affecting your body. But then there's what we call the distal determinants of health. And these are things that are still affecting your health, but you may never think about them. So changing land use patterns. That's some of the healthy communities, the walkability stuff. As the landscape changes around you, it may change your patterns of behavior, but you may never make a connection to land use development. Transboundary contamination, so acid rain or mercury or any other persistent organic pollutants as they move through the system may also be coming and affecting you. When I say you, I generally mean the population of us. So we're really interested in populations more than individuals. Acid rain, ozone, greenhouse gases, climate change, biodiversity loss, plastics. These are all what we would call distal determinants of health, that we know that they can have population-level health changes on us, but it's very hard to make the cause-effect relationship because there's so many other things. If you're poor and you smoke and you drink, how can we say that it's biodiversity loss? You know, we can't. Yeah, that's where we run into some issues. So you're probably wondering where I'm going with this, but really what I want us to do as a group this afternoon is to think about health in the very broad way. And I'm just trying to give you some of the language that people in public health use to talk about these ideas. But we think then about health. It's not just our physical health, but it's our mental health, our social health, our cultural health, our spiritual health, and then this idea of intergenerational health. How healthy are our children and their children? What kind of health outcomes are they going to have access to based on the world that they're living in? And so it took me a long time to get to where you want to be, but how does it relate to forests and trees? And I promise we're headed there now. And so thinking about all these different kinds of health, then when we think specifically about forests and trees, what can that tell us? And we'll come back to this slide, hopefully at the end, and I'm hoping I'll have convinced you that there are at least some links. So what I'd like to do now is draw on some examples, historical examples, current examples, from multiple scales, because the scale at which we define the ecosystem we're interested in will have different effects on us as people, you know, whether it's a broad landscape change or a local, say, change with street trees or something like that. And these highlight many of the different entry points that we have for discussing human health and well-being. And my goal really for this talk is to inspire you as a group to discuss ecological issues as health issues. There seems to be some reticence, and it's partly because health people can be scary, they can be very kind of aggressive, they talk about evidence-based, but we have evidence to support the ideas that we're putting forward. But it's that paradigm shift, that they're not trained to think about what we're talking about here, and there's always some resistance to that. But as a society, we need to start talking about ecology as a public health issue. At least I'm hoping to convince you of that. Because that's how we'll generate change in both our worldview, but also hopefully in some of the programs and the policies that we implement. So I'll just quickly start at this broad scale, but really thinking back to Southern Ontario in the late 1800s and through the Depression, that we had this regional deforestation, broad-scale deforestation. And that basically created ghost towns. People lost their livelihoods. They lost their whole towns. There was much more extreme weather, so more cold and heat. And so people were just really taxed by the elements. And so you can see this as, if we think about these social determinants of health, well, if you've lost your livelihood and you've lost your community and you're exposed now to hypothermia and you don't have the food that you had, this is a health issue. So this is where we can make connections to these broad social ecological changes. And what happened to the people that lived in this landscape? There were big dust storms, so there was respiratory issues of people getting the dust in their lungs, all sorts of things. And it also led to what you may be a little more familiar with, to the flooding. And so as we know that the trees hold back soil, they attenuate rainwater, they slow down the rainwater so the floods aren't as big, they suck up a lot of the water, and so there's not the same quantity. And so flooding back in the early 1900s and the late 1800s, concurrently with regional deforestation, there was this concern with all these floods that started to be more frequent and more severe. And back in the day, people were dying from these floods, so there was mortality associated with these events. I believe the 1937 flood, it was around 20 people who died. More people died during Hurricane Hazel. And then there's the morbidity that we know of associated even with everyday floods, of people getting injured either during the flood or in the cleanup or getting caught in the flood water. But what we now know about flooding, which is quite interesting, is it's actually the mental health challenges. So we know a lot more about how people have long-term mental health problems from losing their house, losing their belongings, the friction caused either in their homes or their workplaces associated with the flood. And so in places like Manitoba, where they have fairly regular floods, most of their public health money for flooding is not so much going to mortality, morbidity, it's going to creating these psychosocial teams that go around and help counsel people and get them through the flood event. Because they realize that until people can get back on track with their mental health, they have a lot of problems getting back on track with all of the other things that are required after a flood. And so flooding then is a public health issue. This is a really interesting experiment that was done. This is called a natural experiment. As you can imagine, in environmental science, it's very hard to experiment on people because in this case, we'd have to go in and infect all of their trees with a bug that will kill them. So there's a lot of ethics around that. And again, it's a problem because in regular health system, we can just do double-blind case-control trials and get this gold standard of evidence. Well, we just can't do anything like that in this field. But you can look for opportunities like this invasion of the emerald ash borer into Michigan, where over 100 million trees were lost. And what was really interesting is the way that it moved through the state was really dependent on people having an infected piece of lumber and taking it home with them. So traveling with these infected trees. And so it was pretty random. It approximated random in the way that it affected the county, which if you're a statistician, you'll understand is a really good thing. And so when they did this study, they were able to look at these counties before and after their trees were decimated by the emerald ash borer. And what they were able to find, let me see if I can find, basically they looked at this increase in mortality related to cardiovascular and lower respiratory tract illnesses in the counties affected. So we're actually talking mortality here. So again, that's pretty major in terms of our health effects. And what they found was that the factors of stress, lack of physical activity, temperature, and poor air quality were all linked to cardiovascular and lower respiratory tract diseases. And these were also linked to the changes in the natural environment and trees. So the stress of having all of your trees dying, the lack of physical activity, because it's no longer green and inviting. The temperature is higher because you don't have the canopy and the shade, and the air quality is lower because we'll see later on how effective trees are in pulling in particulate matter and filtering out other kinds of contaminants. So basically that was the only thing that they know of system-wide that changed in the counties at that time was that the trees were dying. And so between 1990 and 2007, they found an increase in mortality related to these diseases I mentioned, and it was a magnitude greater as the infestation progressed and in counties with above average medium household income, which is counterintuitive because usually it's the poor people who will get sicker. But in this case, totally counterintuitive. The richer people were dying at a higher than normal rate, and they basically found that they often had more trees. These were areas that were more highly dense, and that when they lost these 100 million trees, they lost most of their canopy. So the conclusion of this study that was published in the American Journal of Preventative Medicine was, of course, with the understatement typical of scientists. The natural environment provides major public health benefits. That's actually rare. You almost never see that kind of a statement.
Can I ask a question?
Yep.
Are you suggesting that the canopy is mostly ash trees in Michigan? Because there seems to me that there are a lot of species of trees that aren't affected by that.
Yeah, in this one they looked specifically at the emerald ash, so they looked at ash trees and the 100 million trees that were lost.
But surely that would be a small percentage of the total canopy.
Yeah, but it was enough, is what they're saying. In this study, again, you can cut the pie a million ways, but that's what they found. That was the only system-wide change in the region, and that was...
About the causal relationship versus the coincidental.
Well, you'll always find that in these kind of studies. You'll never find, it's not necessary correlation, but this is what they found. And they certainly went through, they had a rare opportunity to look at what looked like a random spread and to look at, so changing the association between changing canopy cover and mortality from these two different factors.
Question. I wonder, could the overheads be turned off so we can see the screen a little bit better?
Sure.
Well, we're recording it, and we need the ambient light so
Oh, it's
that it
difficult to see from over here.
Well, this is, again, yeah, these kind of studies are very rare, and so I latched onto this one because of the tree, but I think it's really important that we're starting to see, and I think as we go through the slides, you'll see a bit more information that would substantiate why we might think that this isn't a spurious association. So when we look at urban forests, I just want to go a little bit sideways to talking about a really recent initiative of Peel Region, what they call the priority tree planting areas to grow Peel's urban forest. And what was really interesting about this is it's really the first system that I've heard of, that, and certainly that they had heard of, that looks at, on one hand, where are the best places to plant trees in Peel Region. So you can't plant them everywhere. You can't plant them in asphalt. You can't plant them in, on top of buildings. Where are the best places to plant trees? But then they looked at the socio-demographics and said, where, from an equity perspective, where should we be planting trees? So where can we and where should we? And trying to use that to create a more maybe equitable distribution of trees in the region. Because as we know, it tends to be, as we may know, it tends to be the more wealthy communities who have higher canopy cover. And we're going to talk quite a bit more about that in a minute, so I won't go there just yet. But what I thought was interesting here was the 8 overall benefits of tree planting. If you look at them, they're health related. Okay, so mitigating air pollution. Why? Well, because we're concerned about our health. Mitigating urban heat island effect. So health. Contributing to the management of surface water quantity and quality, because we want to have swimmable, drinkable, fishable waters. Maintaining and enhancing natural heritage, that would be cultural. Enhancing economic value, that's a determinant of health. Providing direct cost savings. Supporting improved physical health and emotional well-being. And strengthening communities and enhancing social equity. So these were their 8 priority reasons for wanting to plant trees in the first place. And I think you'll agree that they speak a lot to how we think about whether we do it overtly or covertly, what are the health rationale driving some of these. I'll just quickly touch on community parks, because increasingly we know that we've always wanted parks in our neighborhoods for people to get out, for recreation, for the amenity values. And we've always seen that as having a strong link to our physical health, maybe our social health, building community. But what we're finding in this area now is that we have to think more about what kind of ecologies are in those parks. So do we just want grass and a dandelion, or can we be serving a purpose for the ecological resilience that is underpinning this social resilience around a green space that we're interested in? And so that's the challenge now, is to think not just about creating a green space as a park, but how can we harness that park as having ecological values that, for example, with biodiversity, with stormwater attenuation, other things that both allow us to enjoy that park, but also help build a resilient ecosystem supporting our communities. And so some of the key features of parks, again, we want lots of them in our neighborhoods. In close proximity to residents, we want a diversity of plants, perceived cleanliness, perceived safety, play structures, grass and large trees, water features, community gardens, and access to a range of ages and mobility levels. So that's from a literature review EcoHealth Ontario did on green spaces and health, and what were some of the factors that were most significant in harnessing communities, spaces for people to actually access and benefit from. But what I really wanted to go talk about with that was something a little bit more interesting, maybe a little bit obviously paradoxical. So this urban green space paradox. So we've talked a bit about urban forests and community parks, and they're providing critical social services and community services, and they're promoting physical activity and psychological well-being for urban residents. The distribution of such spaces often disproportionately benefits higher income households. So that's because people move there, they want to live there, and they drive up property values. I have the New York City's Highline Park. That's now become sort of the go-to example when people talk about what they're referring to now as ecological gentrification. But basically, if you build a green space, you can change the whole community around that. So the community around that park went from a very derelict part of New York to now a very coveted part. And, as people started to move in, property values rose. All of this because people value green space and they're willing to pay to live close to them. So many cities have strategies in place to increase the supply of urban green space, especially in park-poor neighborhoods. what that's doing is, as you add more green space, you're increasing housing costs and real estate values. So basically, this urban green space paradox is saying that the more you try to help lower income populations access the benefits of green space, the more you're driving them out of the neighborhoods that they're living in because they can't now afford to be in these coveted areas that people actually want to live in. And so you're creating, in a way, environmental refugees in the most microcosmic sense, but driving people out of communities as those communities become more coveted. And green space and street trees and those kind of investments are just incredible in their power to change neighborhoods. So there is a movement called Just Green Enough that really tries to tackle this idea of gentrification of neighborhoods and displacement. And what I find is kind of funny about this, in a sort of sick sort of way, is that it requires an organized fight against market forces and environmental advocates. So you have to fight everyone to say, no, don't put in, as they say here, the parks, the cafes, and a river walk, because the low-income community that you thought you were benefiting will not be there in 10 years, 15 years. They'll be driven out, and middle-class people will now be living by the parks, the cafes, and the river walk. So they're in favor of these small-scale scattered sites through a community, urban agriculture, community gardens, but green spaces that are just enough to add value to people's lives, but not enough to get other people to want to live there. So it's an interesting thing that comes out when you start to take a public health or an equity lens to green space. It's not all, it's not as intuitive as you might immediately think. I'm going to switch gears a little bit to talk about what you might have heard of. Is a new program called Mood Walks. And so this has been run, I think, for about two and a half years now by Conservation Ontario and the Canadian Mental Health Association. And the whole idea is to get people out into nature, get them walking and talking. So it's often facilitated small groups. In some cases where people have high mental health problems, so they may not want to be around other people, so it may not be a group hike, it might be an individual kind of hike. But it's taking people out. Primarily, they're going to Conservation Authority lands and just walking for maybe an hour. But it's providing the transportation to get them out into these green spaces and then letting people just walk and talk as they see fit. And so it's building social capital among the people who are in these groups. So that's being used for depression, anxiety, but also schizophrenia, some of the other stronger mental health issues. For youth at risk, there's been quite a bit of success. Peterborough has a specific focus on youth at risk, getting them out into the forest. And so it's really thinking about this restorative benefit of landscape, the exercise as well that people are getting. And it's tied in many ways to this Japanese concept of forest bathing. So the Japanese, for thousands of years, have, when they've gone to a doctor, they might be prescribed to go forest bathing. And that's essentially to go out in the forest, leave to take off your clothes, but just immerse yourself in the forest. And they have quite a sophisticated understanding of the benefits that are linked to the pheromones that the trees are emitting, that are linked to all of these senses that we have. So it's not just walking in the forest, it's not the physical, it's the visual, it's the sensory, the tactile, the olfactory, all of our senses benefiting from being out. The theory that people tend to talk about in at least Western society, they don't talk as much about forest bathing, but they will talk about attention restoration theory. And that's this idea that our minds get tired. And they get tired of sharp angles, they get tired of focusing and having to pay attention to what we're doing. In urban environments, it's felt that because the lines are straight and rigid and people are worried that they're going to get hit by a car or run into, that you're on guard all the time. And so there's this idea of directed attention fatigue. And what's been shown to be most interesting in this theory is this idea of soft fascination or involuntary attention. And what people are finding is that these landscapes of the twinkling leaves or water glinting off of a lake. Okay, you guys have it all here so you can see the lake, you have the forest. But your mind, there's a very narrow range of variation in those landscapes. So the green is just different colors of green. The lake is just twinkles of lake. So it's very soothing on your brain, essentially, that your brain can kind of just relax because the landscape stays the same. It doesn't, nothing's going to come out and grab you. And, so this is subconsciously, but the studies have shown when they've hooked people's brains up to these different landscapes that it's very soothing. So there's a few other factors in attention restoration theory, but I'll just talk about soft fascination. So it's typically associated with contact with nature. It's capable of restoring your voluntary attention. So you're more able to focus and concentrate after you've had this sort of relaxing moment. Lets you gain some distance from your routine activities and thoughts. And particularly natural landscapes have been found to be relaxing in that regard. So in some places, this is actually from New Brunswick, where they're starting to prescribe, so this is actually in the sick care system, prescribing people that they should get out and exercise. This is a more generic get out and exercise. But in some places, for example, in England, they are finding that doctors are specifically prescribing mood walks to patients who they think will benefit. So right now in Canada, there's really next to no, or at least in Ontario, there's no real connection between the medical system and the mood walk program. But think of the possibilities if you were suffering from depression or anxiety, that you went to your doctor and your doctor gave you a prescription and said, I want you to join this mood walk program. And just to see if we'd get more people out there, what the outcomes would be. So we don't really know, but there's a movement afoot to start integrating these kinds of alternative treatments into the medical system, as opposed to some of the other programs that we currently have. Again, I'm giving you the roundabout of examples here, so hopefully I haven't lost you and I'm not too far behind time. So I'll talk just a bit about school greening, which is near and dear and horrible for me because I have a 3-year-old, and this is in fact her daycare. So it breaks my heart to see this. But school greening is another program where trees play an integral part in starting to think about the connection between landscape and health, and particularly children's health. And so what they found in studies of these asphalt, which is of course the low-cost option for your schoolyard, what they found in these studies is that the kind of play is very gendered. So basically boys will take over, and the vast majority. Girls and young children are shunted off to the sides. And that the play is very structured and it's very hierarchical. It's very much about winning and losing and rules and how to play. And so that's the kind of environment. And some of the writers in the school greening literature talk about school grounds as moral geographies. And so I think this idea of a moral geography goes beyond just school grounds, but it's thinking about what kind of places are we creating and what does that mean. So in the school grounds, in this case, it means we're creating strongly gendered, hierarchical, rule-bound thinkers, essentially, and social actors. What they find with school greening is that it breaks down a lot of that gendered play divide and a lot of the accessibility divide. That when you have a green school ground that has trees and paths and things to jump over and pick at and bugs and all those kind of things, the kids play more creatively, they play more collaboratively, their play is less gendered, and kids with disabilities have more opportunities to enter into that play, as opposed to being entirely excluded from it. So school greening has a lot to offer in terms of, there's increasing amounts of work being done to try to quantify, because everybody wants these benefits quantified. There's certainly anecdotal evidence around kids being more creative, being more socially engaged, and having a lot of really interesting cognitive changes from being in a school ground that's been greened as opposed to a traditional concrete playground, if you don't change anything else about the pedagogy that they're involved in. But from a more traditional public health, there's a very strong link and a very big concern over ultraviolet radiation and school playgrounds. Because children are most at risk from the sun. If you have a bad sunburn as a child, it will stay with you, the threat to you for the rest of your life. So if you've had bad burns as a child, it's one of the things you need to be worried about as a risk factor. The exposure to sun is frequently related to outdoor play. And so it's looking at shade and creating shade policies and shade guidelines to try to make sure that these spaces, particularly for children, are adequately shaded. So shade is cost effective and the best means of reducing skin exposure and skin cancer risks. So again, when we talk about primary prevention, we talk about shade, and then we can talk about trees. Now, trees take a while to grow, so there's artificial shade as well. But a lot of it now is about thinking about planting in schoolyards and planting specific kinds of trees that at certain times of day will be shading the structures that you want shaded. And there's computer programs you can buy that will tell you exactly where. Any landscape planners would be familiar with that. And so, of course, they require planning and maintenance to have this benefit. But, you know, I ask you to look at this structure, and it's exactly the one, well, it isn't the one, but we stop often on the way for a summer holiday at a school in the dead of summer that has this basically exact structure. You know, you can answer the question yourself. What are the extra benefits we're getting? We have a play structure. That's the benefit. It's supposed to be for recreation. No one can play there in the summer. It's too hot. It's scorchingly hot. Even they've done some studies of if it were metal, if they had the metal slides, some of them get up to 50 degrees, and kids have had actual like first-degree burns on their legs from going down these slides in the summer. So we have this, which is presumably for recreation. Well, now we can only use it maybe 8 months of the year, because certainly as the summers are getting hotter, nobody's going to be out there. We're exposing them to a skin cancer risk that they really didn't need. And then we're finding out that most of Canadian children are not anywhere near meeting their recreational and physical activity guidelines. They're not playing outside after school. And the ones that are, they're not playing for very long. So there's, I could get the exact statistics, but I'd have to juggle a piece of paper, and I'm not going to do that. But suffice it to say that we have the Canadian children not getting enough outdoor ed and exercise, and we're creating structures like this that make it even more difficult. So what we want to think about then, when we talk about trees and green space and school grounds, is leveraging these co-benefits. So we can get a lot more out of these structures if we think more broadly about what it means to be healthy and what they're for. But these co-benefits need to be communicated to and from a wide range of stakeholders. So the sum total of benefits exceeds the cost, but only if they're accounted for. And the kind of benefits we're talking about then in a schoolyard would be benefits to health, to well-being, to ecosystems, to biodiversity, to green infrastructure, greenhouse gas emissions, safety, security, future generations. And just to give you a sense, maybe I'll just skip ahead. You know, this is the kind of thing. Why not have school grounds that look like that? Okay, you can get a lot more out of that in terms of attenuating groundwater from rain, for biodiversity, all sorts of things, and still create playgrounds. And this relates as well to these theories for children's health and the environment. One is called extinction of experience. And the idea is that people lose the wherewithal to reverse the trend in biodiversity loss if they're increasingly disconnected from nature. So if kids are not playing out in nature and they're not connected to biodiversity, they are unlikely to care when they're adults. So it's as simple as that. It's the extinction of experience. They haven't had that experience. They're not interested in that experience. It's hard to create that love of nature in adults who have not had those experiences early on. And then nature deficit disorder, which you may have heard of, Richard Lou's Last Child in the Woods. He's the one who popularized this. But there are strong indicators of the absence of direct experience with the natural world in many children's everyday lives. So there's growing demands on children's time, resulting in less free and unstructured outdoor play, reduced mobility and less range for exploration, growing fear of strangers, traffic in nature itself, dramatic rise in obesity and severely overweight, vitamin D deficiency and other health issues, and a lack of knowledge of species that may also be an indicator of engagement in nature. So you can see it's a cyclical thing. We create these play structures and say, oh, why aren't you out there? You know, and then we say, oh, why aren't you interested in bugs and dirt? Well, there isn't any. It's rubber and you know, some kind of sanitizer. So this is school greening, and you can see this is a logo from a workshop that was just held last year in Peterborough. I gave a talk, similar kind of theme, more around the co-benefits of tree planting for health. But it was called A Passion for Trees, Enhancing Shade in Municipal and School Settings. So they brought around a bunch of stakeholders in Peterborough with the idea of moving towards a shade policy, shade guidelines, and wanting to get stakeholder support for that in the community. And again, the driver on public health is UV radiation, which is just one small part of a much more interesting puzzle. The very last, no, almost the last one that I want to talk about are street trees. This is a really interesting thing because it's both widely regarded as a mechanism for addressing climate change adaptation. We want to plant more trees to adapt to the hotter climates that we're going to be seeing and the more extreme weather. But trees are also vulnerable to climate change. As we all know, they're not all equally robust under these new conditions. And so the very adaptation you have is also at risk from climate change. But they provide services like shading, cooling, and water uptake that become even more valuable the more we think about extreme weather. So we get a lot out of street trees right now, but we'll get even more benefit as the weather gets more extreme and more pressure is put. What I find really interesting about the street tree literature, and I guess I don't have it on here, but I underline the word valuable. Because it's only in urban forests and street trees that you will see economists getting involved in this green space, this health and trees discussion, or value of trees. So TD Bank did 2 different studies focusing on quantifying the benefits received from street trees for different cities in Ontario. There's a lot of econometric studies done about what is the dollar value of the benefits that we have from trees. And let me see if I can. So they found urban trees have a replacement value of only $51 billion in Halifax, Montreal, Vancouver, and Toronto, but they provide more than $330 million of benefits, which is a lower bound, as they say themselves, because it doesn't include the value of tourism, recreation, or increased property values. So some of the major things associated with these street trees aren't even in this value, and they already find that it's of a cost benefit. It's in favor of street trees for all of the services that they provide. So this is one of the fields where you can find a lot of studies quantifying the benefits of street trees for pollution reduction and other things, which is really unusual in our field. These previously mentioned studies from TD Bank don't include health benefits at all. And so they're not talking at all about health benefits. They looked at wet weather flow, air quality, energy savings, carbon sequestration, and energy emission abatement. Okay, so what we're saying is that then if you look at the health benefits of those trees, you get even more of a dollar value in favor. So this is a study by Kaplan in 2015.
Slide it over, we've lost part of it.
Oh, I don't think I can actually. Sorry. But it's very similar to the invasive species study that we looked at earlier in terms of a broad epidemiological study on a broad landscape. They looked specifically at street trees and a variety of health outcomes, and they noted the correlation between street trees and neighborhood wealth. And this was done in Toronto. What they found, I won't go through the whole study, was that having 10 more trees in a city block on average improved health perception, so how people perceive their own health, in ways that were comparable to an increase in an annual personal income of $10,000 and moving to a neighborhood with a $10,000 higher median income, or being 7 years younger. You can choose which one you'd like. They also found that having 11 or more trees in a city, on average, decreased cardiometabolic conditions. And so this is not self-reported. This is the health data, in ways that were comparable to an increase in annual personal income of $20,000, moving to a neighborhood with $20,000 higher median income, or being 1.4 years younger. So this was just a recent study. I mentioned it because it's Toronto. It was done by the David Suzuki Foundation and some other partners. But trying to then bring in the health benefits into this heavily quantified field of street trees. And so we're quantifying all of these environmental services that are provided. If we added on some of the health benefits that we've already seen floating around in the literature in other places, then we could get even stronger. But I want to harp a little bit more about these benefits of street trees. So I've talked about climate change. So there's absorption of carbon dioxide. There's lower energy costs from shading. So shading is huge. There's absorbing the local pollutants mostly from automobile exhaust, so ground level ozone, sulfur, and nitrogen dioxides. But they also take the small particulate matter onto the bark of the trees. So the bark will actually have these particulates settle out on them. And so a 1913 study, for example, by Norwalk, estimated that trees and shrubs in Toronto remove approximately 1,950 metric tons of air pollution each year, with a societal value of 16.9 million Canadian dollars per year. So again, heavily quantified, but just particulate matter alone is having this, 1,000 odd, almost 2,000 tons of pollution taken out of our air. And that's where you start to see the link to respiratory, because these particulate matter are going to the side of the road, but they're not going to the front step, right? Quite a few are being intercepted. In terms of ecological integrity, these street trees give us our biodiversity, so lots of animals and plants. They intercept rainwater, they suck it up through their roots, they take it in, and so they have less water going into our sewer system, which helps keeps our rivers and sewers cleaner, our rivers cleaner, eventual outcomes. And these are supposed to be food trees, so you can have your apples. We get our apples from the neighbor's tree, and there's mushrooms there and other things. And then there's migratory birds, so habitat for migratory species. Some of the infrastructure benefits of street trees. This is a little known fact, but it turns out that they're very effective at protecting asphalt from being degraded by the heat of the sun. And so they reduce your costs substantially for replacing your asphalt of your street, which is a huge cost. So there's a whole literature on asphalt and street trees. There's noise attenuation, so decreasing the noise that's moving through your community, which can really help with people's mental health, as you can imagine. Street trees can reduce traffic speeds by making the street seem narrower, so people drive more slowly because they're a bit worried that the street is perceived to be narrower. They act as windbreaks, which can help reduce energy costs as well. And reduce solar glare for drivers, so that you're not squinting and having blind spots from the sun. And here are some other benefits, just communal benefits that the trees provide. I've already touched on some of them. So aesthetic, beauty, mental and physical health. This always happens if I talk for too long. UV radiation, recreation, children's health, community safety, property values, privacy, employment opportunities, promoting learning, and contributing to a sense of place. So my question to you is, if there were a pill or a vaccine that could do half of that, wouldn't we be a lot more excited? How amazing that we can write off street trees and not think about, oh, hey, they give us health benefits in terms of respiratory and cardiovascular health, but they also do all these things for greenhouse gases, and they also protect our ecosystems. They provide habitat. They do an unlimited amount of things. And so here we almost value these pills a lot more than we value what's already around us. And so there is a movement in the EcoHealth world. Some people like to talk about vitamin G, vitamin green. And personally, I'm against it. It makes it seem like something that you can just pop the pill and you'll be okay. But this is why, because pills are a lot more powerful, and the idea of the quick fix is a lot more powerful. Street trees do require ongoing investment, and so this is an example from Toronto. I'm not sure which neighborhood. You can see when it was first built in the early 1900s, there were no trees. Then there were some nice trees in the 20s, now full canopy on some of these very wealthy streets. But they're all planted at the same time, and basically they're all going to die at the same time. So you have to have this cycle of refurbishment. So just as we talked about health being a process for people, it's a process for trees as well. Two more things I'll touch on, and then I'll wrap up. One is the sociocultural value of trees. So we all intuitively know that there's value to trees. We put them in our art, we put them in our literature. It promotes our wellness, our quality of life. And our emotional, or what are called our affective responses to nature. So that's just the emotional response that you have to nature. But I dropped biophilia in here because you might have heard of the term. But that simply means love of nature. There's this idea that biophilia is innate. In fact, what's been proven is that biophobia is innate. So you actually have a natural innate rejection of spiders and scorpions and things and snakes, but you have no innate love of nature, sadly. And that's why it has to be instilled in people, and particularly in young people. So biophilia is a nice concept that gets a lot of traction, but doesn't actually stand up. This is the last one I want to mention. This is this idea of virtual trees. What it really means is a lot of studies have been done in hospitals and other settings where they find that people recover more quickly if they have access to a visual representation of nature. You don't even have to be in nature, but if you have these kind of murals or pictures or even screensavers, that you still have this effective response. You have a physiological calming response. And so there's a whole network of people interested in art and how can we get more natural art. There are some parameters on the kind of art that has this beneficial effect, but a lot of it is art that has a nature theme, but a positive, uplifting theme as well. And this ties into hospital gardens and other things that I haven't gone into, horticultural therapy. There's a whole other literature around health and gardens and hospital and other institutional gardens, prison gardens, things like that, for rehabilitation. But I just wanted to make the point that you don't even have to be in nature to receive benefits from trees. You can look at pictures. And that what we mean by effective response, again, is an emotional response. And a lot of studies in a lot of different parts of the world have found a very similar thing, is that people seem to have an affinity, a general affinity for savanna-like or park-like scenes. They least prefer felled trees, but also a very dense understory, anything that seems threatening with nature. And artificial elements that are introduced into otherwise natural landscapes significantly reduce people's enjoyment of those landscapes, which is some of the wind power resistance comes from that aesthetic aspect. So just to come back where we started, I'm hoping that I took your time, used it wisely, to convince you at least that there is a link between trees and our spiritual, our physical, our cultural, our mental, our intergenerational, our emotional, and our social health. And that this is a way of thinking and talking about this topic that is perhaps long overdue. Trees to Live By is really thinking about these links that can be made between trees and all aspects of human health and well-being, so not just our physical health. The evidence is becoming stronger every day. Public health needs to expand its definition of health to explicitly include the ecological determinants of health, and that's coming very, very slowly. And we all talk about, we all need to start to talk about the ecological integrity as a health issue for current and future generations. So the fact that we're losing our ecosystems, we're losing our biodiversity, we have plastics in our oceans and plastics in our food and in our water and in our land, and the myriad of other terrible things that are going on. These are health issues. They're health issues for us, and they're going to be much worse for the next generation. And we need to talk about them not as things that only tree huggers care about, but as things that every person should be concerned about. And so that's really what I'm asking you to think about. Trees planted at multiple scales and in multiple sites represent critical public health prevention infrastructure. And so this is public health prevention, and we need to start talking about it like that. Thank you.